Appreciate it. Okay, we are live. Hello, YouTube. Good morning, and welcome to the Lurie Daniel Favors Show Experience. We got some things we want to talk about today, and so I appreciate you all joining us once again this morning. We may or may not do a second live today. I'm not quite sure how the timing's going to work. Just know that this may be one of two or not. We're just not sure yet. I want to say that today is a very special day. It is in some ways a sacred day. It's not the only sacred day in the history of what I'm about to describe for you, but it is a very important day. Today is August the 20th, 2025, which means it has been 406 years since the first enslaved Africans were trafficked into these United States. And I think that that is a date that we should remember. It's something that we should hold dear. 1619, August 20th, in Fort Comfort, I believe it was called, Virginia. That's where that first ship disembarked. And it's important that we have this discussion because we're living in a time right now where there's a lot of idiocy. Right? We're living in a time right now where foolish people are running things, and foolish people who run things believe that everyone should be a fool and should stay quiet. And that's why y'all's president has put out a statement that basically says he is very upset about the museums. He's upset about the museums because he believes that woke is broke. And he literally said the following. In fact, I'm going to share the screen so y'all can see it because y'all be acting sometimes like who is this man standing behind me? Oh, it's a whole group of people behind me. All right, sorry. We in the studio today, so sometimes that'll happen. But I want you all to take a look at this. Hold on, let me pull it up. Take a look at this statement that y'all's president made, and we're going to talk about why it is so important that we double, triple, and quadruple down on the realness of our history. So y'all's president, can y'all see this? Hold on, let me make sure. Yes, okay, here we go. Y'all's president said the following on his very untruthful program. The museums throughout Washington, but all over the country, are essentially the last remaining segment of woke. The Smithsonian is out of control, where everything discussed is how horrible our country is, how bad slavery was, and how unaccomplished the downtrodden have been. Nothing about success, nothing about brightness, nothing about the future. We are not going to allow this to happen, and I have instructed my attorneys to go through the museums and start the exact same process that has been done with colleges and universities where tremendous progress has been made. This country cannot be woke because woke is broke. I'm sorry. Because woke is broke. We have the hottest country in the world, and we want people to talk about it, including in our museums. Because, yes, Donald Trump, museums is always where we talk about the future. But museums are actually where we talk about the history, the real history of what has happened in this country. And museums are often monuments of theft and thieving because most of the museums that we revere around the world are often located in European nations, including the United States. And it's full of stuff that y'all stole from other places, except in the United States, we also have this thing called the African American. There's African American museums. There's a National History of African American history and culture is part of the Smithsonian. That's one of the museums that he's been talking about here. Donald Trump does not like to talk about true things because whiteness is a philosophy and a governing policy that does not allow you to talk about true things. And when he said woke is broke, just as an aside, did anybody else think about crack is whack? I'm sorry. Was it just me who went back to Whitney Houston? Crack is whack. When she was talking to Diane Sawyer. When he's like, woke is broke, crack is whack. It's all the same, but she was so much more classy about it. But basically, it's important that we're having this conversation right now because we have been talking about education this entire week, and we will continue to do so because we're back in back to school mode. And it really matters that we're crystal clear about what's happening, and we're crystal clear about the fact that this is a survival mechanism. Ignorance and not knowing things are survival mechanisms for people who have a culture that their ancestors intentionally created to be the most thieving, diabolical, destructive, and malignant force on the planet. Now, it's not the fault of the descendants that that's the system that their ancestors created, but the descendants have not shifted that system. They have not engaged in any meaningful actions or behaviors or systemic structural change that would shift that system. So now what their ancestors have done, as the Bible say, the sins of the forefathers shall be what? Carried out on the son, or something like that. I might have made that up, but y'all check your Bible, you should know. But basically, we're in a situation right now where on this day, and to be clear, August 20th, 1619 was not when the enslavement of African people started. And I know that people like Jillian Michaels like to say things like, well, everybody had slavery. And yes, Jillian Michaels, everybody did have slavery. In Europe, you guys had the feudal system, the serf system, which is very similar to indentured servitude. The word slave is actually at the root of it is Slav, indicating the Slavic nature. It was a very European understanding. Many thousands of people were bought and sold into slavery. Here's the difference. Slavery, prior to the creation of chattel slavery, was something that might happen as a function of being a prisoner of war. I might capture you, you might capture me, and you were going to be a slave in the new society in which you had been captured, but that meant that you were going to retain your humanity. You might marry into the family, and you would even be able to become a learned person if you weren't already. You would be able to participate and the leadership structure of that society. You were not ever going to lose your humanity. You were not going to be able to lose your rights to being considered a human being. That is what happened, or that's what existed prior to Europeans, who then became white people. That is what happens when that's what the system was before Europeans remixed it. Now, y'all don't produce a lot of things that are not in some way destructive to the planet. But one thing you did do was remix slavery in a way that nobody else had done before. So kudos to you. Congrats, I guess. But essentially, in the 14th century, Spain and Portugal had begun capturing enslaved Africans. I'm sorry, wrong language. They had begun capturing free Africans who they enslaved in Europe, because the first slave trades, at least as it pertains to the transatlantic nature of it, went into Europe. Now, prior to that, we had people from what we now call the Middle East, but was really larger parts of Africa prior, who slavery had been happening. Slavery had been happening. Slavery was happening in Jesus' time. Slavery was happening before Jesus' time. Here's the difference, though. Here's the difference, because after the 1400s and the 1500s, when the Portuguese and the Spanish were trafficking Africans not into Europe, but now into Brazil, now into Colombia, into Puerto Rico, into the Dominican Republic / Haiti, into Jamaica, into all these countries, it had not yet made it into what we now know as these United States, even though a portion of them had been in what we now consider Florida. That was when Florida was a Spanish colony. That's a story for another day. We're talking about the Brits. Talking about those whites. And basically, slavery expanded into colonial America, where those first enslaved Africans were brought into what we now know as Virginia on August 20th of 1619. And that was in the Virginia colony at a port called Port Comfort on the James River. There were about 20 plus black people who were on a ship called the White Lion. The White Lion was a British ship, an English ship that basically hadn't gone to Angola to secure these Africans. It had pirated the Portuguese ship that had gone to Angola to secure these Africans. And while historians have talked about the fact that the first enslaved, there was some question about whether or not they came from the Caribbean, whether or not they came from Africa. Now, recent reports indicate that they did, in fact, come from Angola. But the reality is, they were being introduced into a system, into an American colonial system that was at its very beginning. And at this point, the primary labor force for Europeans in this part of the world was indentured servitude. Poor whites. It was poor white people who were the basis of the labor system, and poor white people were often former criminals. They were people who could not hack it in their home country. No shade. You just couldn't do it. Couldn't hack it in your home country. And it wasn't necessarily your ancestors' fault that they couldn't hack it in your home country. The wealthy people in your home countries were as diabolical as the wealthy people were here. And they created a system where a lot of y'all lived in caves. You were not allowed to learn how to read. You had like a 99% illiteracy rate in Europe, even though you had African people who, yes, had an oral history, but were also reading in multiple languages and symbol systems, I might add. And so it's not the poor Europeans' fault that when they came here, they were downtrodden with very little skills, but they were the basis upon which the early Americans were relying for labor, the wealthy Americans. Now, what happens at around the mid-1600s is they began realizing that, frankly, indentured servants don't have the skill set, they don't have the mindset, they don't know anything about farming, they're bad at agriculture because they don't come from agricultural communities. Meanwhile, these enslaved Africans that you can buy on an auction block, baby, they're agricultural geniuses. Do you see the fact that they were the breadbasket of the world when they were back in their home country? And they had knowledge. They understood how to deal with the climate. They understood because the climates were similar. And so enslaved Africans were a cheaper investment that had a longer return on investment, because I could buy you and hold you for life, which had never happened before, Jillian Michaels, owning you for life, and then owning all your children for life, which had never happened before Donald Trump. And so that was the employment system that wealthy white people moved to. And it is unfortunate, because there used to be a time when poor whites used to have a shot in this colonial settler project. There used to be a time when you could be a poor Brit, Scot, Dutchman, German, or other European. You could come over to this colonial land after being released from prison, of course, because most of us were criminals, and you could begin a long sorry. Sometimes I break character because it's hard. But basically what happened was, these people who were criminals and unskilled, unlearned, illiterate, and uneducated in any meaningful way, they would come here, and it was no longer a worthwhile investment for the wealthy Europeans to continue doing that. And so wealthy white people began the first effort at defunding the whites. And wealthy white people defunded poor white people almost entirely. They got your poorly educated ancestors to agree with a free labor system that was in direct competition with the fact that they could not work for free because they were poor whites. And because of that agreement that your poor ancestors made with your wealthy ancestors to basically agree to being defunded, that is directly related to the fact that right now states like Texas and Florida are considered the most economically disenfranchised states. Thank you, Business Insider and Yahoo Finance. The most economically disenfranchised states, because you have perpetuated this Confederate approach to living, this white nationalist approach to living that has bad policies. It doesn't allow you to have jobs, healthcare, housing, or education, but you get to be white. You get to be white. And that's why your president doesn't want y'all going to museums, because when you learn these things, you realize that there really is no such thing as white racial solidarity. There's the wealthy whites who conspire against you. They get you to give up all your rights, to give up all your things, because they tell you that you're better than all the people who aren't white, and you fall for it. You guys are unfortunately the biggest marks on the planet. You have a history of not learning things, and the only people on the planet who move that way. It's really weird. You should stop doing that. And that's also why you keep getting played by the richer versions of your community that laugh at your racist bumpkin asses all the way to the bank. But anyway, by the late 1600s, enslaved African labor now becomes the dominant labor system in Virginia. Poor white people had been completely disenfranchised and defunded, but they were willful participants in it because at the same time, they were learning a new category for themselves. They were no longer Scotsmen. They were no longer Dutchmen. They were no longer Brits. They were white. And that meant something in a society built on racism. Unfortunately, it didn't mean enough for you to have health care or to keep your teeth in your mouth. It doesn't mean enough for you to actually have quality living conditions now, but you're okay with that because being white is all that you need, because again, y'all are some of the biggest marks on the planet. So on this day, we acknowledge this history. We acknowledge the history of the enslaved Africans who prior to being enslaved were free black people who were minding their business, who were birthing their babies, who were educating their families, who were healing and learning, and scholars and studying the stars and becoming more in tune with nature and figuring out how to be better agricultural scientists and thinking about what it meant to expand societies and what it meant to build a society and what does it mean to have justice? What does it mean to pursue someone who has done wrong in the community? How do we uphold right living and right being? How do we do those things? And when we acknowledge that those people were out one day on August 19th, 1619, minding a black ass African business, not bothering nobody. And by the 20th of August, and actually technically it was several months prior to that, they got here on the 20th. I'm being a little facetious and tongue in cheek about this, but the reality is there was one day earlier this summer, 406 years ago, when these enslaved Africans, the 20 who were on this ship, the White Lion, when they were minding their own black ass African doing good for the planet business. And that evening found themselves in shackles, found themselves chained, and found themselves in situations that basically where they were going to be walking 4 miles to get to the coast. And then once they got to the coast, they were going to spend months on these awful, horrific, traveling, floating concentration camps known as slave ships, and inserted into a system of white domination that has persisted until this day. We have seen at the outset of enslavement, that is the beginning of the dark ages for African people. And it's one of the reasons why, oddly, I'm very encouraged by where we are right now. And I know it feels weird to say that. I know it feels odd. I know it feels, considering everything that we're talking about, the fact that y'all's president is shutting down museums and shutting down history. And they're doing that because they realize the jig is up. They realize the jig is up. And we, the people of this planet, I actually have a Fragile White segment a skit that I did in the podcast that's coming out later today that talks about all of this more in depth. Urban View, I don't know if the Fragile Whites are going to have time to make it onto the episode today, but it is in the podcast. But essentially, we're in a situation where these people who have a history of not knowing things because the things that they know make them uncomfortable. What we now know is that the antidote to all the evils that we're dealing with right now, the antidote to that is knowing things, is learning things, is reading books, is tapping into scholars and sitting with discomforting facts and thinking about what it means to take in new information and shift your opinion. The antidote to everything that is disrupting our society right now is knowledge, is knowing things, and knowing things in a way that is fused and rooted in love for who we are, love for us, love for our community, loving us the way that Harriet Tubman taught us to love each other, which is figuring out how to love each other more than we were taught not to. Learning how to love each other more than we were taught to hate each other, and doing so rooted in factual, accurate information, because what we have seen is that both in Donald Trump's mind and in the world of Fragile Whitelandia, that when you know things, the truth really does set you free. And it is only the ignorant, the foolish, the debased who believe that being woke is broke because their brains are broken. And it's a sad state of affairs, but we're going to let them figure that on their own, because we are going to do the work of making sure that we know the things that are going to help us and our people to thrive. Urban View, we are going to head into commercial break. We have a great guest coming on who's going to talk with us about their effort at their organization to ensure that blighted blocks and housing. What is her name? Kathleen Guillaume Del Mar is going to be with us from the Center for Community Progress, talking about their effort to ensure that they can fix the systems that lead to vacant and abandoned and deteriorated properties. So stay tuned for that, Urban View. YouTube, not sure if we're going to be back today. Maybe, maybe not. If so, it'll be around the 11 o'clock hour. If not, y'all know I love you and we'll be back tomorrow.